My son's hand closed around my wrist at 20 minutes past 9 on a Wednesday morning inside Cedarville Savings and Trust. "Sign it over," he said, "or I'll have you declared unfit." His fingers were trembling. Mine were not. I had spent 40 years repairing things other people considered beyond saving. I knew the difference between something broken and something deliberately dismantled. Craig was not broken. This is a story about time, about what it reveals when you are patient enough to let it work, and about what a man builds when the person he trusted most turns out to be the one he needed protection from. I am deeply grateful you chose to be here for it. Tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. Country, city. Leave it in the comments. Every answer makes this feel less like a video and more like a conversation. This story contains fictionalized elements shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. Characters and locations are fictional. The message, however, is worth holding on to. The floor of Cedarville Savings and Trust is polished limestone, pale gray with a faint blue vein running through it, the kind of stone that holds sound the way a pocket watch holds time, precisely and without forgetting. I know this because I spent 7 seconds lying on it. 9:23 on a Wednesday morning in June. I had walked in at 9:08, taken ticket 31 from the dispenser beside the entrance, and folded it into my breast pocket beside 6 other objects that ticked softly against my ribs with every breath. 6 pocket watches. Each one older than my marriage. Each one carrying something inside its case that my son had never thought to look for. The lobby held the usual mid-morning quiet. 5 teller windows along the far wall, 3 of them staffed. 6 high-definition security cameras fixed at each upper corner, angled to leave no square foot unrecorded. Navy blue chairs in 2 rows down the center aisle. I chose the 3rd chair from the left in the front row. The cushion had gone flat and the left armrest wobbled, but it gave me a clean sightline to all 6 cameras and an unobstructed view of the main entrance. 40 years of opening mechanisms that other people had sealed teaches you where to sit. You choose the position that lets you see what is recording and what is entering. After long enough, you stop noticing you are making the decision at all. I opened the manila folder on my lap. Documents prepared by Margaret Chen of Chen & Associates. Elder law. 28 years in practice. The paperwork was for a living trust, a legal instrument that would place the Pratt Sunflower Farm on County Road 7 under permanent protective terms. Once filed, no one could transfer, encumber, or sell that land in my name without my personally witnessed consent. The kind of quiet document that ends certain arguments before they begin. While I waited, I noted 2 things without looking directly at either. At window 3, a broad-shouldered man filled out a withdrawal slip with the focused patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. He was not a customer. Frank Olsted. 22 years as a detective with Cedarville Police before retirement. I trusted him the way you can only trust someone. After you have watched how they behave when the situation turns genuinely difficult and none of the comfortable options remain. Near the glass doors, a man in a brown corduroy jacket studied a home equity brochure with more attention than any brochure has ever warranted. Roy Pemberton, 72. Retired mail carrier. 31 years on the Cedarville route. He knew every family in this town by name, and he had been watching my son's house for 3 months without Craig noticing, because a man who has walked the same streets for 3 decades knows how to be present without being observed. Neither man looked at me. That was exactly right. The main entrance doors swung open at 9:41, pushed too hard for someone who was not in a hurry. Craig, dark slacks, button-down shirt. A tie sitting off-center in the way of a man who had been moving fast before he arrived. His jaw was set. His eyes swept the lobby and found me in under 2 seconds. He crossed the floor quickly. "Dad." He stopped close enough to make it personal. "You need to leave. Right now." I did not look up from my folder. "I am visiting my bank, Craig. This is not how we handle things." The measured tone was thinning. The particular erosion of a man who had managed a situation from a distance for 10 months and was suddenly standing inside it with no margin left. I closed the folder, looked up at my son. I am sitting in a chair. His hand closed around my left wrist. I did not pull away. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Exactly the way a man does when he knows precisely what he wants the other person to do next. Craig's control broke. He shoved me sideways, a flat-palmed push against my shoulder, and I caught the edge of the transaction counter going down. Right elbow, on limestone first. Left wrist, folding wrong beneath me. I lay still. The stone was cold through the back of my jacket. The fluorescent lights above cast that particular institutional white that makes everything beneath them look worse than it is. 6 watches ticked against my chest. I stared at the ceiling and let 3 things settle into place. The ticking, the sound of Frank Olsted stepping out of the teller line, and the small, specific knowledge that I had been planning to be on exactly this floor, at exactly this moment, for longer than my son could possibly understand. 7 seconds. I counted them the way I have counted seconds inside 10,000 watch cases. Carefully, without rushing. Then I smiled. Frank covered the lobby in 8 unhurried steps and positioned himself between Craig and the counter. He held up his retired detective credential at a height Craig could read without straining. Not a threat. A presence. Roy had already folded his brochure and moved to the entrance doors, standing with his hands at his sides. 3 bank employees reached for their phones. The manager was already crossing the floor toward me. Craig had not stopped talking. He doesn't understand what he's doing here. He gets confused. There's a medical evaluation on file. He addressed Frank without understanding who Frank was or why Frank was not moving. A man does not smile when his body meets cold stone. Not unless the stone is exactly where he planned to be. But to understand that smile, you would need to go back 10 months. You would need to start with a gas leak at midnight. A dead woman's envelope sealed with her own thumbprint, and 6 pocket watches that had been quietly ticking inside a house where no one suspected they were listening. You would need to start with Dottie. Dottie died on a Friday in May, which was wrong in a way I could not explain to anyone who had not spent 34 years learning what her Fridays meant. Fridays she baked. Fridays she cut sunflowers from the south row and arranged them in the kitchen window where the afternoon light hit the petals at an angle she had once described to me as the reason she planted that particular row. In that particular row. Direction. A woman does not die on her best day, but she did, and the calendar has not corrected itself since. I have tried in the time since to find a way to describe her without describing what she looked like, because her face changed across 34 years the way all faces do. But the things she did with her hands and her voice and her time stayed the same from the first year to the last. When she read, she tapped her fingernails lightly against the windowsill. 3 soft taps. A pause. 3 again, without appearing to know she was doing it. It happened with every book, every newspaper, every seed catalog that arrived in the mail between January and March. If you pointed it out, she would look genuinely surprised. Hold still for exactly 1 page, and then start again. I pointed it out perhaps 6 times across 3 decades. She was surprised every time. She knew every sunflower variety on the farm by name and by season, and she would correct you if you called one by the wrong name, never sharply. She would simply say the right name once, clearly. The way a patient teacher offers a correction that feels like additional information rather than a rebuke. Mammoth Gray. Stripe. Autumn Beauty. Teddy Bear. Italian White. She had planted the last row herself the spring before her diagnosis, because she said the farm needed something younger coming in, or the whole operation would age out from under us. The farm sat on 15 acres along County Road 7, 3 miles east of Cedarville proper. Dottie had started the sunflower operation in 1991 with 4 acres, and a conviction that the soil along the creek bed would produce commercial-grade stems if she managed the drainage correctly. She was right. By 2005, the farm supplied 3 regional florists, and a farm stand that operated from June through October. Every autumn, she organized a harvest festival. The whole town came. Children ran between the rows. Families took photographs against 8-foot mammoth stems. Dottie stood near the entrance with a cash box and a warmth that made every person who passed through feel as though the festival had been organized specifically for them. The pocket watches were hers, not mine. People assumed they belonged to the watchmaker, but Dottie had started collecting them in 1989, 2 years before I opened my repair shop, because she said she liked the idea of carrying time in your pocket rather than strapping it to your wrist. More personal that way, she said. More deliberate. There were 6. A Waltham from 1892, purchased at a Connecticut estate auction the weekend we were married. An Illinois Springfield from 1910, inherited from her father. A railroad man who believed a watch should outlast the person who wound it. A Hamilton from 1920, bought the afternoon Liam was born because Dottie said every child deserved to arrive alongside something that would still be running long after they were grown. An Elgin from 1905 that we found together at a barn sale outside of Chillicothe on a Saturday in October, when the trees along the highway were so bright it hurt to look at them directly. And 2 others, whose stories I will tell you when we reach them. Each watch sat in a glass display case that Dottie had chosen herself. A walnut and glass cabinet with brass fittings and a small lock, the kind of case built for objects that matter more to the people who own them than their market value would suggest. The important things go in the case, Eugene. She said it the way other people say goodnight. A principle she had arrived at once and never revisited. The legal structure was also her idea, and it was the most consequential one. She held 50% of the deed to the farm. I held the other 50. She had structured her share as tenancy in common, a legal arrangement in which each owner holds a distinct, independent share that passes through inheritance but cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the written agreement of all parties involved. When she died, her 50% passed jointly to Craig and Liam. Any sale of the whole farm would require both sons to consent in writing. Neither son alone, not even with my full cooperation, could complete a transaction without the other's signature. She told me why over a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she talked. I want both boys to have to agree someday. That is how you keep a family talking to each other. She had the clause drafted by one attorney and reviewed by a second and paid both invoices herself without mentioning either until the documents came back signed. The envelope appeared on the kitchen table 1 week before she was gone. White, standard size. Sealed with tape, she pressed down with her thumb. The impression was still visible on the adhesive. She had written on the front in the blue ink she always used for things she intended to be permanent, for Eugene. When the time is right, you will know. I did not open it. She had not told me to open it. She had told me I would know when, and I trusted her judgment on timing the way I trusted her judgment on everything else, completely and without needing to verify it first. May 19th, 2023. She was gone faster than the doctors had prepared us for. I have looked for the right words for that Friday morning, and I have not found them, so I will let it sit as it was. A Friday, the wrong day for what happened in it. 17 months passed. I kept the farm running with a crew of 3 who knew the soil and needed little direction. My back would no longer allow me to work the rows alone, but selling was not something I considered. The sunflowers were Dottie's. The yield mattered less to me than it once had. Craig called monthly through the first winter, every 6 weeks, through spring, then without a pattern I could follow. Liam called every Sunday from Montana, reliable in the particular way of a younger son who suspects his father is handling things less well than he lets on. I kept the display case on the dresser in the bedroom. 6 watches, ticking faintly behind glass. The envelope sat beside it, sealed, waiting for the moment Dottie had told me I would recognize. 17 months of quiet. 17 months of sunflowers growing and being cut and growing again without the woman who planted them. I did not know it then, but someone in my own family had already decided that those 15 acres were worth considerably more as a line item on a developer's spreadsheet than as a field of flowers planted by a woman who believed the soil along the creek bed deserved to be taken seriously. October 11th, 2024. 12 minutes past midnight. The smell reached me before the sound did. It was not the faint, accidental odor of a pilot light gone out or a burner left cracked on the kitchen stove. This came from below, from the direction of the basement stairs, and it carried a chemical concentration underneath it that did not belong to anything that fails on its own. Not gas finding air through a worn connection. Something sustained, something with a source that had been applied rather than accumulated. 40 years of examining the internal mechanisms of objects that other people take at face value teaches you a specific skill. You learn to distinguish between a thing that happened and a thing that was made to happen. I registered the difference in the first seconds of being awake. Then I moved. I did not think about the furniture. Not the kitchen table Dottie and I had driven to a shop on Route 11 to buy in 1993. Not the bookshelves she had filled over 3 decades with everything from seed catalogs to novels she read twice. Not the framed photographs along the hallway wall, 34 years of faces frozen at various stages of believing the future would hold still for them. I went to the bedroom dresser. The display case was where it always was. Walnut and glass. 6 watches, ticking faintly behind the brass lock. I lifted it with both hands the way you lift something that belongs to someone you miss. Not because the object is fragile, but because the care is the point, and the point has nothing to do with weight. The sealed envelope sat beside it. I took that too, pressed it flat against the glass top of the case, and carried both toward the front door. 85 seconds from waking to having the case in both hands. 100 seconds from the first breath of gas to the front porch. Dottie's principle applied in the one moment it had been built for. The important things go in the case, Eugene. I stood in the driveway in the dark of early October and held the display case against my ribs and watched the emergency lights arrive. The volunteer fire crew from Station 4 was there within 8 minutes. They worked the perimeter and ventilated what they could, but the house was a wood frame structure from 1958, and wood frame structures from that era do not survive the kind of event that begins in a basement at midnight with a concentration that has no accidental explanation. The gas company investigator arrived at 2:15 in the morning. He spent 40 minutes in the basement with a flashlight and a clipboard before emerging with an expression I recognized from decades of watching professionals encounter things they cannot yet explain to the homeowner. He told me the preliminary assessment would take several weeks. He told me to find alternative accommodation. He did not tell me what he had found, which told me more than anything he could have said. Craig arrived 35 minutes after the first engine. He came alone. Patricia had stayed home, he said. His shirt was clean, not the wrinkled fabric of something pulled from the back of a chair in the dark by a man startled from sleep. Clean and pressed, with the collar sitting flat in the particular way of a shirt that had been put on deliberately in front of a mirror. His eyes were clear, fully open, without the specific redness that stays with you for a good hour after someone drags you out of a deep sleep before dawn. He walked toward the house with the settled, unhurried movement of a person for whom the scene was confirming something rather than revealing it. "Dad." He stopped beside me and looked at the damage. "Oh God. Are you all right?" The words were correct. The sequence was correct. They arrived 1 full beat later than they should have. The way a clock chimes at the right hour but half a second behind, close enough that most people would not notice, far enough off that a man who has spent 40 years listening to timing mechanisms knows immediately that something inside has shifted. "The house is done," I said. "Come home with us. Patricia already has the guest room ready." I held that sentence for a moment. The way I hold a watch, I suspect, is counterfeit. Turning it over. Checking the weight. Patricia already has the guest room ready. Before I had mentioned a hotel. Before I had said anything at all about where I would stay. Before the fire crew had finished their assessment or the gas company investigator had come back up from the basement. The guest room was already prepared. I looked at the display case in my hands. 6 watches ticking against the glass. Dottie's envelope pressed flat on top, the thumbprint in the tape still visible under the emergency lights. Then I looked at my son. standing beside my ruined house in a clean shirt at 35 minutes past midnight with eyes that were not red, and a guest room that was already made. Okay, I said. It was the only word I had. I told myself the feeling was grief and adrenaline, and the particular disorientation of standing in your own driveway, watching everything you built with someone you loved fill with a smell that should not have been there. I told myself I was reading shadows into a face because it was past midnight and my home was gone, and I was 68 years old and holding a dead woman's watches against my chest. I told myself these things for exactly 14 days. On the 15th day, I stopped. Not because I found evidence. Not because Craig made a mistake I could point to and name. I stopped because in 40 years of examining mechanisms, I have learned that when something runs half a second off, the problem is never in the face of the clock. It is always deeper. It is always in the part you cannot see without opening the case. And I was not yet ready to open this one. But I had stopped believing it was keeping accurate time. The guest room at Craig's house had been prepared with the kind of precision that tells you more about the person who arranged it than the person it was arranged for. A printed medication schedule sat on the nightstand, correct down to every dosage and time. An extra pillow had been added to the bed, firm, the kind sold at medical supply stores rather than department stores. The closet had been cleared to 3/4 to make room for whatever I brought. A glass of water sat on a coaster beside the lamp, already poured, already waiting. Patricia's work. I recognized the efficiency. She was a licensed clinical social worker with 12 years of professional experience, and she had prepared that room the way she would prepare a client intake, thoroughly, methodically, and without the small imprecisions that come naturally from actually knowing a person. Everything was correct. Nothing was personal. She had not asked me what I needed. She had already decided. I noted this without remarking on it. I have spent 40 years noting things without remarking on them. It is the only professional habit I carried from the shop into every other room I have ever entered. Craig and Patricia's house was new construction on the north side of Cedarville. Clean lines, open layout, the kind of design that photographs well and lives in carefully. Within the first week, I observed two things I did not mention. A stack of unopened bills sat on the kitchen counter for 5 days before anyone moved them. Patricia's car, visible from the guest room window each morning, carried a registration sticker, 11 months expired. I filed both details the way I have always filed things that do not yet have a context. Quietly. Until they do. On the third day, I unwrapped the Waltham from the display case. 1892. The watch Dottie had bought the weekend we were married at a Connecticut estate auction, where she had outbid a dealer from Hartford who did not expect a 24-year-old woman in a sundress to know what a Waltham Model 1883 movement was worth. She knew. She always knew what things were worth, and she was never embarrassed about making sure other people knew she knew. I asked Craig if we could hang it in his study. Dottie would want it somewhere people actually spend time, I said. Craig agreed without hesitation. He fetched the ladder from the garage himself and held it steady at the base while I climbed with the watch case under one arm. I positioned it on the wall above his desk, 2 millimeters to the left, then one back, until the case sat level and square in the exact way Dottie would have required. Craig held that ladder with both hands and watched me hang his mother's watch directly above the place where he sat and worked each night. There is something I have thought about many times since. A man who helps you mount a piece of his mother's memory above his own desk. A man who holds the ladder steady and says it looks perfect. I did not know then what that watch would eventually carry inside its case besides a movement from 1892. Craig did not know either, but he held the ladder, and I remember that. The address change form appeared in week 2. Set beside my coffee cup on a Tuesday evening, with the low-key practicality Craig had been applying to everything that month. Just so your mail routes correctly while you're getting settled, he said. It looked like a standard single-page form. I reviewed it and signed without reading closely enough. I understood only later, considerably later, that the form contained more fields than any legitimate address change requires. There was a line for a social security number, partially pre-filled in Craig's careful, unhurried handwriting, waiting only for the last 4 digits. I provided them without realizing what I was providing. That form was the first piece in a structure that took my son 7 more months to finish building. Also in week 2, I opened my pill organizer on a Sunday morning and found that my heart medication, a 10-milligram tablet I had taken every morning for 9 years, a pill I had held in my palm enough times to know its exact weight and texture the way I know the weight and texture of every watch component I have ever handled, had been replaced. The substitute was fractionally lighter. Its surface was slightly smoother, the white less chalky, by a degree that most people would never register. I held it up to the bathroom light for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is longer than it sounds when you are standing in your son's bathroom, holding a pill between your thumb and forefinger, and asking yourself whether the conclusion forming in your mind is the product of evidence. Grief. It was not grief. 40 years of distinguishing genuine from counterfeit had trained my fingers to register the difference before my conscious mind arrived at the same conclusion. The pill was wrong, not dangerously wrong. A common supplement, sized and colored to approximate a cardiac medication, available at any drugstore without a prescription. Not sophisticated, sufficient for a plan that relied on a man who was not paying close attention. I flushed it. I retrieved my actual medication from the interior lining of my travel bag, where a backup bottle had lived since my first year of independent work, because 4 decades in this profession teaches you to keep a spare of anything you genuinely cannot do without. I said nothing. That evening at dinner, Craig asked about the weather forecast. I paused before answering. Not long. 2 seconds. The kind of pause that belongs to a person whose attention has briefly drifted somewhere it cannot quite reach. Craig noticed. I watched him notice without appearing to look for it. The performance began at that kitchen table, at that quiet moment. It cost me nothing except the sustained discipline of someone who has spent 40 years watching genuine and counterfeit sit side by side and knowing which is which without telling anyone what he sees. Every Sunday after that. Substitute down the drain. Real pill from the travel bag. Craig, watching for signs, the change was taking effect. And I gave him exactly what he was watching for. My son held the ladder while I hung his mother's watch directly above his desk. He did not know that within 8 weeks, that watch would hold something he never thought to look for, and he would have helped me put it there himself. The thick envelope from Heartland Prairie Development Group arrived on a Thursday in November. I was sitting in the adjacent room with a book open on my lap when Craig intercepted it at the front door, a habit that had formed quietly across the previous weeks, the mail always appearing pre-sorted on the kitchen counter by the time I saw it. He opened it standing at the counter with his back to me. I watched his back go completely still. It was not the stillness of surprise. Surprise moves. It searches for a response. Shifts weight. Turns toward the nearest person for confirmation. This was different. This was the stillness of a man receiving information that has just reordered everything he was planning to do and in what sequence. He stood at that counter for 9 seconds. I counted. Then he folded the envelope shut, slid it into his jacket pocket, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Anything important? I asked from the other room. Just junk, he said without turning around. That evening at dinner, Craig asked a question he had been carrying for several hours. I could tell by the way he set it down on the table, carefully. The way you place something you have been holding in both hands and have only just decided to release. Whether I had ever thought, really thought, about what the sunflower farm might be worth to someone who saw it differently. A real offer, he said. Something worth considering. Seriously. I told him the truth. Dottie had left her 50% under tenancy in common. I could not sell without Liam's written agreement, and even if I could, I would not want to. The sunflowers were hers. The soil along the creek bed was hers. The festival every autumn was hers. I was keeping them because they were the only things left that still held the shape of her hands. Of course, Craig said. I was just curious. He reached across the table, and refilled my water glass without being asked. I went to sleep that night, believing it had been a reasonable conversation between a father and a son who sometimes thought about the future in different terms. I did not know that Craig had already read a number inside that envelope large enough to permanently rearrange every priority inside his head. Everything that came after grew from the moment he read it and decided that I was an obstacle rather than a father. November brought the first frost and something else. A change in the air of that house, so gradual, I kept trying to explain it away as weather. My mail started arriving pre-opened. Not all of it, and not always, but enough to establish a pattern. A statement from the county auditor's office. A letter from the attorney still wrapping up Dottie's estate. Correspondence from the farm crew forwarded from my old address. The first time it happened, Craig explained without being asked. I thought it was a utility bill. Didn't want you bothered. I accepted this. The second time, neither of us mentioned it. By the third, I had stopped expecting explanations and started paying close attention to what arrived and what did not. The phone was subtler. I had a phone with 3 years of contacts in it and numbers I trusted, and I began trying to use it. I called Harriet Voss, a woman Dottie had known for 30 years and whose professional judgment on documents and authenticity I had relied on more times than I could count. The call connected and routed cleanly to voicemail. I tried the next morning. Same result. And again the day after. What I eventually understood was that Craig had gone into my phone settings and configured all unrecognized incoming numbers to redirect silently to voicemail without ringing. A small adjustment. Simple to make, difficult to notice, and precise in its effect. It severed contact from anyone who would need to call me directly rather than go through the house. I confirmed it on a Thursday afternoon during a short walk Craig had been encouraging as good for my recovery. I stopped at the house of a neighbor I had spoken to once at the mailbox and asked to borrow their landline. Harriet answered on the second ring. Her voice carried the careful, unhurried quality of someone who has been waiting for a call that never came. You tried to reach me 4 times, Eugene. Not one came through. That does not sound like a phone problem. I told her I was all right. That something had come up. That we would talk properly when I had more room to speak. We kept it to 90 seconds. I walked back at my regular pace and was inside before Craig's car returned to the driveway. Liam had gone quiet. This I had not anticipated. When I finally reached him through a brief window while Craig was out of the house, using the neighbor's phone again, Liam told me that Craig had sent him 2 messages in October, that I was recovering from the displacement and preferred not to be contacted during the adjustment period. Liam had respected it. He was a considerate person by nature. The kind who does not push when someone asks for space, and he had no reason to question where the message had come from. He had not known to question it. I stood in that neighbor's kitchen holding a phone that was not mine and listened to my younger son explain why he had not called in 6 weeks. Because his brother had told him not to. Because his brother had used my name to say it. And because Liam trusted his family enough to believe the message without verifying the source. I thanked the neighbor. I walked home. I sat in the guest room with the door closed and looked at the display case on the dresser. 6 watches behind glass. Dottie's envelope beside it, still sealed. And around me, in every direction, a house where every door I had trusted to remain open had been quietly locked from the outside by the person who held the keys. Craig asked that evening whether I had ever considered what the sunflower field might be worth to someone who saw it differently than Dottie had. He had asked this before. The repetition was not carelessness. It was pressure applied in small, patient increments, the way a mechanism is tested by someone who wants to find the point where it gives. I said I had not considered it. He refilled my water glass without being asked, and I went to sleep that night understanding, with a clarity that no longer required any effort to maintain, that my son had read a number in that envelope large enough to turn a father into an obstacle, and that every wall being built around me had been designed to make sure I could not reach the one person whose signature would prevent Craig from getting what he wanted. Liam. The power of attorney document appeared on a Sunday morning in December, set beside my coffee cup while I was still reading the paper. Craig placed it without ceremony, the same precise, casual positioning he had used with the address form in October, as though the document had arrived there on its own and he was simply making sure I noticed. "Just a legal formality," he said. "If something happened to you suddenly, it would make everything far easier for the family. A power of attorney is a legal instrument that grants another person full authority to make financial and legal decisions on your behalf. Once signed, it does not require your ongoing consent at each step. In the right hands, it is a practical convenience. In the wrong hands, it renders a person legally voiceless in their own affairs." I had spent 40 years working with mechanisms designed to protect valuable things. I understood precisely what this document would do if I signed it, and I understood precisely why Craig needed me to. "I'll think about it," I said, not because I was considering it, because a man who refuses cleanly and directly reveals that he understood exactly what was being asked of him. I was not yet ready to reveal that. A watchmaker does not tell the customer what is wrong with their timepiece until he has finished examining every component. You open the case, you study the movement, you identify every point of failure, and only then, when you are certain you have found them all, do you close the case and deliver the diagnosis. I had not finished examining. 2 days later, Craig became efficient instead of warm. He answered questions with the minimum number of words that could technically qualify as a response. He moved through the house with a purposefulness that left no space for incidental conversation. Meals were shorter. Eye contact was briefer. The temperature in that house had dropped, and it had nothing to do with the December frost outside. This was the cost of saying I would think about it. Craig had built a timeline in his head, and my hesitation had introduced a variable he had not accounted for. I recognized the pattern because I had seen it before, not in my son but in mechanisms. When a watch runs under stress, the mainspring compensates by tightening. The movement becomes faster, more rigid, less tolerant of deviation. Craig's household had become a wound mainspring. Everything still functioned. Nothing was comfortable. One afternoon in the second week of December, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Patricia was at the sink, her back to me, washing dishes in the automatic rhythm of someone performing a task that requires no thought. Then she turned. Not fully. Halfway. Her hands still damp. Her eyes found me at the table. Something was forming in her expression. Not distress and not accusation. Something earlier and quieter than both. For mine. A look of a person standing at the edge of a decision about whether to say something they have been carrying for longer than they expected to carry it. She opened her mouth slightly. From the hallway, Craig's voice arrived, easy and unhurried. The tone of a man simply looking for something. "Patricia, do you have those insurance forms I mentioned?" She turned back to the sink. Both her shoulders dropped a fraction. The small, specific settling of a person putting down something they had almost picked up. She did not look at me again before she left the room. I sat at that table for another moment after she was gone. Whatever had been forming in Patricia's face, whatever sentence had been assembling itself behind her expression, it had closed. I filed it the way I have filed things for 40 years. Carefully, without forcing a conclusion before the mechanism reveals what it is doing. What does not make sense today sometimes explains everything 3 months later. That evening, Craig allowed me 90 minutes to walk to the pharmacy and back. I chose the smallest spiral notebook on the rack. $3.50. I paid in cash. I put the receipt in the trash can inside the store and carried the notebook home in my jacket pocket. Back in the guest room with the door locked, I wrote the date in the upper right corner of the first page. December 14th, 2024. Then I began. For 40 years, I had opened the cases of other people's timepieces and examined what was happening inside. I had found rust, and I had found sabotage, and I had found simple neglect, and I had found deliberate, patient alteration designed to make a mechanism fail at a specific time in a specific way so that the failure would look like age rather than intention. Now, I was inside the case, and the hand on the winding crown was my son's. I wrote what I knew. The address form with the pre-filled social security field. The medication substitution. The mail arriving opened. The phone settings, redirecting incoming calls. Liam's silence, engineered by 2 messages Craig had sent using my name. The Heartland envelope Craig had pocketed in November and called junk. The power of attorney, placed beside my coffee cup, on a Sunday morning. I wrote what I did not yet know. Where the money from Heartland was intended to go. What Craig had been saying in his study with the door closed on the evenings. I heard his voice but could not make out the words. What Patricia had been about to say at the kitchen sink before Craig's voice arrived from the hallway and closed the door she had been opening. I closed the notebook. I placed it beneath the mattress. Then I took the second pocket watch from the display case. The Illinois Springfield. 1910. Dottie's father's watch. A railroad man's timepiece, built for accuracy under pressure, designed to keep running when everything around it was moving. The next morning I placed it on the bookshelf in the living room. So Dottie has company in this house, I said to no one in particular. Craig glanced at it from across the room and said nothing. Patricia, passing through on her way to the kitchen, paused for half a second and looked at the watch on the shelf, the way she had looked at me at the kitchen table, as though she were trying to determine what it meant that I was placing pieces of my dead wife's collection in visible positions around a house where I was supposed to be losing my ability to track what mattered. She did not ask about it. She continued to the kitchen. I heard the water run. That night I locked my bedroom door. Not against an intruder, against the part of me that wanted to walk down that hallway and put my hands on my son's shoulders and ask him what happened to the boy who used to sit beside me on Saturday mornings while I showed him how to open a pocket watch case without scratching the hinge. The boy who held his breath every time I lifted the movement out, as though the mechanism might stop if he exhaled at the wrong moment. I did not walk down the hallway. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the notebook to the second page. And I continued building a case against my own son. I want to be precise about the time because in the version of this story where I look better, I woke up knowing something was wrong. The truth is simpler and less flattering. I woke up because I was 68 years old and could not sleep through the night consistently anymore, and I wanted water, and the house was dark except for one thin line of light at the far end of the hallway. 11:47 on a Tuesday night in January. I stood in the doorway of my room and looked at that light. The strip beneath Craig's study door, thin and steady, the kind that comes from a desk lamp pointed downward rather than an overhead fixture. Then the part of me that had spent 40 years training itself to notice things other people walk past, said very quietly, "Stop. Listen. Do not move yet." I moved down the hallway in the way I had learned to move through spaces where I was not supposed to be heard. Close to the wall, avoiding the center of the floor where old houses store their complaints in the joints between boards. Craig's house was newer than that. But the habit was older than the house, and I did not see a reason to abandon it at 11:47, on a night when the only light in the building was coming from a room where my son believed he was alone. The gap beneath the study door was perhaps 3 centimeters. Enough. Craig's voice was low, deliberate, entirely without the inflections a person uses when they believe someone might be listening. He was not pacing. The voice stayed at the same distance from the door throughout, which meant he was sitting, probably at the desk, probably with his back to the door, which meant the gap carried his words more clearly than he would have wanted. The conservatorship petition is ready to file. The deed transfer is contingent on the medical documentation clearing judicial review. A pause. The specific silence of a man listening to a response on the other end of a phone call. It doesn't matter. The Heartland deal is already structured. I have the deposit cleared. $55,000. The authorization documents hold as long as he doesn't reach a specific kind of attorney in the next 60 days. I did not move. I did not shift my weight. I did not let my hand drift toward the wall for balance. 40 years of working inside mechanisms that fail when you apply force in the wrong place teaches you that your own body is the most common source of interference. You go still. You let the room carry the sound to you rather than leaning into it. The medical route is the secondary track. Craig's voice continued, unhurried and technical. The voice of a man who has rehearsed the architecture of a plan until it has stopped feeling like one and started feeling like procedure. Once we have the evaluation documented, Patricia is handling that side. It goes to the probate court as supporting evidence for a conservatorship petition. Under Ohio law, the court can appoint a guardian with full authority over financial decisions when the subject has been assessed as cognitively impaired. At that point, his signature on any transaction stops being a legal requirement. A brief silence, then something that was not quite a laugh. Short, low, without warmth or embarrassment. The sound of a man acknowledging something privately convenient. He thinks he's still sharp. He's a 68-year-old widower who fell apart once already when his wife died. We just need the right moments documented correctly. The voice stopped. The call was finished, or at least that part of it was. I could hear the faint sound of Craig shifting in his chair. The Waltham on the wall behind him would have been ticking. I thought about that for a moment. My son, sitting beneath his mother's watch, in a room where her memory hung on the wall, saying the words I had just heard, in the voice I had just heard them in. I counted to 30, not in my head. I moved through each number with the specific deliberateness I had learned across 4 decades of working with objects that require patience and steady hands. Because men who are trained to count slowly under pressure count slowly, even when every part of them wants to move. At 30, I turned. I walked back toward my room along the outer edge of each step, close to the wall, where the floor sits nearest the structural support beneath and carries the least flex. I reached my doorway and stepped inside. I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were completely still in my lap. The particular kind of still that I recognized from the most difficult moments in 40 years of work. The moments when the case you are building stops being professional and becomes personal. When the knowledge you have just acquired is no longer something you can hand off or file through the proper channel. When it is yours to carry, because there is no one above you to give it to. I sat with that for a moment. Then I reached beneath the mattress and pulled out the notebook. I opened it to the next blank page. I wrote the date, January 7th, 2025. Then the time, 11:47 in the evening. Then I wrote what I had heard in the order I had heard it. In the plainest language I could manage. Not interpretation, not analysis. Just the words, as they had come through the door. Conservatorship petition ready. Deed transfer contingent on medical documentation. Heartland deposit cleared, $55,000. Authorization documents hold if no attorney reached in 60 days. Patricia handling medical side. Probate court. Guardian appointed. Signature, no longer required. New line. He thinks he is still sharp. 68-year-old widower. Fell apart when wife died. Document the right moments. I read it back once. Then I wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. I cannot fix this alone. I sat with those 6 words for longer than I usually allow myself to sit with difficult things. They were not easy to write. Not because of what they admitted about my situation, but because of what they admitted about my limitations. I had spent 40 years being the person who opened the case and found the problem and fixed it. I had trusted my hands and my eyes and my patience to be sufficient for any mechanism I encountered. And now I was sitting on the edge of a bed in my son's house at midnight, holding a $3 notebook and writing down the first honest thing I had written since I arrived. I closed the notebook. I put it back beneath the mattress. And I made a decision that would take 5 months to complete. It would begin with a woman who had spent 30 years examining lies through a magnifying glass, and had never once been fooled by a forgery that thought it was good enough. The first genuinely free afternoon I had was a Thursday in February, when Craig had a 2-property showing scheduled on the east side of town. I told him I would walk to the pharmacy. He reminded me to stay on the main road and be back within the hour. The particular instruction of a man who has grown comfortable managing another person's movements and no longer hears how it sounds. I walked 4 blocks past the pharmacy. Harriet Voss's shop occupied a narrow storefront on Belworth Street, between a closed barber shop and a laundromat that had been in continuous operation since 1957. The front window held 2 pocket watches on velvet stands and a handwritten card about estate appraisals in lettering that had faded unevenly in the sun. The bell above the door was the original brass mechanism from 1961, a lever-arm striker with a tone that belonged to a previous century. I know this because I repaired it in 1994, the same year Dottie brought Harriet to the shop for the first time and introduced her as the woman who can tell you whether a signature is real just by looking at how the pen left the paper. Harriet was 74. She had spent 30 years as a forensic document examiner, first with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and then in private practice, analyzing questioned signatures, forged instruments, and disputed documents for attorneys in courts across the state. She had retired 8 years ago and opened the antique shop because she said she preferred objects that admitted their age honestly to documents that lied about everything, including who had written them. She was standing behind the counter with a loop around her neck and a mantel clock open in front of her, examining the maker's mark on the movement plate. She did not look up when I came in. She finished what she was examining. Then she set the loop down and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Eugene Pratt," she said. "You look like a man who has walked past where he was going." I told her she was correct. Then I told her everything. I told it in the order it had happened, without commentary or interpretation. The gas leak in October. Craig arriving in a clean shirt 35 minutes later, with a guest room already prepared. The address form with the pre-filled Social Security field. The medication substitution I had identified in 4 seconds and had been managing silently every Sunday since. The mail arriving opened. The phone redirecting unknown callers. Liam's silence, engineered by messages Craig had sent using my name. The Heartland envelope Craig had pocketed in November. The power of attorney placed beside my coffee cup in December. And the study door at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in January. Every word Craig had said through that 3-centimeter gap, recited in sequence, because I had written them down within 4 minutes of hearing them and had read them back to myself every night since. Harriet listened the way she had always listened in her professional life. Without notes. Without interruption. Without the small nods that tell a person they are being believed rather than being heard. Complete, focused stillness. The stillness of someone who listens to understand the entire shape of a thing before she commits to any single part of it. 14 minutes. When I finished, she was quiet for 6 seconds. I counted. "Bring me everything he has signed in your name," she said. "Every document. Every form. I have examined forged signatures for 30 years, Eugene. A forged signature fails the same way a counterfeit watch fails. It looks correct until you know exactly where to check. And I always know where to check." She paused. "Dottie would have come to me first. You know that." "I know," I said. "She would have come 6 weeks ago." "I know that too." Harriet looked at me for a moment with the particular directness of a woman who has spent 3 decades telling people things they need to hear in precisely the way they need to hear them. Then she nodded once and picked up her loop and went back to the mantel clock on her counter. The conversation was finished. The agreement was complete. Between people who have known each other through the same person for 30 years, certain commitments do not require additional words. I left the shop and walked 2 blocks north to the Walgreens on the corner of Belworth and Main. I went to the electronics aisle at the far end. A prepaid tablet sat on the bottom shelf. Entry-level, cellular capable. I picked it up, carried it to the self-checkout register, and paid $39 in cash. I did not take a receipt. Cash. For anything you do not want attached to your name. 40 years of examining other people's paper trails teaches you that lesson early and permanently. Back in the guest room that evening with the door locked, I connected the tablet through its own cellular signal rather than Craig's home network. Another habit. You use your own connection when you do not know who controls the one being offered to you. I placed a video call to Liam's number in Montana. He answered after 2 rings. The relief on his face was immediate, visible even through the small screen. He leaned forward, then stopped, then reset himself the way a man does when he has been holding something for weeks and does not trust himself to set it down without it breaking. "Dad, are you all right?" I told him I was. I told him what Craig had done to his phone, to his messages, to the information Liam had received about my condition, and my preferences and my silence. I laid out what I had in order: the mail, the phone, the medication, the address form, the power of attorney, the hallway. At 11:47, Liam listened through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'm flying down. I can be there tomorrow." "Not yet." I kept my voice low. "If you walk through that door before I have built something solid, Craig closes every opening I have. I need time to assemble something he cannot explain his way around. Give me 2 months." A silence on the small screen. Liam's expression was the controlled stillness of a younger man who has just been asked to be patient about something that requires the opposite. "2 months, Dad. And then I am on a plane whether you say so or not." 2 months, I said. I ended the call and dialed Harriet without pausing. She answered before the second ring. We did not open with pleasantries. I gave her my social security number. She confirmed it and said she would pull credit reports from all 3 federal bureaus and work backward from whatever she found. The call took 90 seconds. The next morning I met Frank Olstead at the diner on Main Street. Frank was 68. 22 years as a detective with Cedarville Police, now working part-time bank security. A man of very few words and very steady hands. I had known him since 2003, since a case we did not discuss in general company. I gave him what I had. He listened the way Calvin listened, the way Harriet listened, the way people listen when they have spent careers hearing difficult things, and have learned that the listening is the most important part. He asked one question. "What do you need from me?" "Position," I said. "And patience." He nodded. We finished our coffee. That was sufficient. I walked back along the same 4 blocks at the same pace. Craig's car was not in the driveway. I had 11 minutes of margin. I used 3 of them standing in the kitchen looking at Dottie's Waltham on Craig's study wall. Ticking evenly, patiently, and I thought about a woman who once told me that time was the only honest thing she had ever found in a world full of approximations. I had repaired more than 4,000 timepieces in 40 years. I had restored movements that other watchmakers had declared beyond saving. I had opened cases that had been sealed for decades and brought the mechanisms inside back to accurate time through patience and precision and the understanding that every component, no matter how small, serves a function that the whole depends upon. I had never built one to listen. On a Monday morning when Craig had not yet looked up from his phone and Patricia had already left for the hospital, I mentioned the Waltham. Not as a request. I said it the way Dottie used to raise things she had already decided. As an observation that carried its own conclusion without requiring a response. "The chime has a slight delay," I said into my coffee cup. "Half a second behind where it should land. The kind of thing a person who didn't know the watch well would never notice." I had heard that Waltham's mechanism correctly 10,000 times across 34 years. Dottie would have hated it running off. I said this in the same tone I might use to say the newspaper was late. Something small, released into the kitchen without expectation. Craig did not look up from his phone. "Sure, Dad. Get it serviced." 5 words from a man who had no idea why that particular sentence was going to matter. I took the Waltham down from the study wall myself. I reached both hands up and settled them around the case, the way you hold something that belonged to someone you miss. Not because the object is fragile, but because the care is the point, and the point has nothing to do with the object. I carried it out to the car, set it on the passenger seat with the face up, and drove to the shop on 5th Street where I had worked for 23 years before I retired. The current owner, a younger man named Dennis who had apprenticed under me for 4 years, was at the workbench when I came in. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He never had. That was one of the reasons I had trusted him with the shop. I told him what I needed. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded and went to the back room. The recording unit was smaller than I had expected. Roughly the diameter of a shirt button, matte black, designed to sit recessed inside the cavity behind the decorative backing plate of the watch case. From the front face, invisible. From any angle available to a person sitting at a desk in front of it, it did not exist. It ran on an internal battery rated at 72 hours of continuous operation and stored compressed audio on a micro memory card smaller than my thumbnail. I installed it myself. Dennis watched but did not assist, because he understood that there are certain things a man needs to do with his own hands. I fitted the unit into the cavity, checked the angle of the microphone aperture against the expected position of Craig's desk chair, and replaced the backing plate with a thin tool I had used 10,000 times across 4 decades. The fit was precise. The mechanism ticked correctly. The half-second delay I had invented as a pretext was now genuinely corrected, which meant the watch was running better than it had before I created a reason to open it. Ohio operates under one-party consent for audio recordings. Any participant in a conversation occurring within a space where they reside can legally record it without the other party's knowledge. As a resident of Craig's household, I qualified. The recording was legal. What it captured would be admissible. I knew this because Frank had confirmed it the previous week, citing the specific statute number without needing to look it up, because men who have spent 22 years in law enforcement carry certain numbers the way watchmakers carry certain measurements, permanently, without effort. Craig held the ladder again. Same stance as August. Both hands on the base, easy and practical. A son helping his father with a task that needed 2 people. How does that look? I asked from the top of the ladder. He glanced at the watch for perhaps 1 second. Perfect. Just like it always was. He picked up his phone and went back to whatever he had been reading. I stood in the doorway and looked at the Waltham on the wall above his desk, ticking correctly now, positioned exactly where Dottie had wanted it, and carrying, behind the face she had chosen in 1892, something that would record every word my son said in that room from this moment forward. I went to make tea. That evening, the watch began doing what I had built it to do. Over the following week, I modified the remaining watches. Not all at once. One each day, during the hours Craig was out and Patricia was on shift. I worked at the kitchen table with a cloth laid flat, and my tools arranged in the order I had used them for 40 years, and I opened each case and fitted each unit with the same care I had applied to every repair I had ever performed. Because the quality of the work is the quality of the work regardless of the reason behind it. Dottie had taught me that. She said it about sunflowers, and I had applied it to everything else. The Hamilton from 1920, the watch bought the afternoon Liam was born, I placed on the mantel in the living room. The Elgin from 1905, the one we found together at the barn sale outside Chillicothe, I set on the windowsill in the kitchen. Each one positioned where a grieving man might place pieces of his dead wife's collection around a house he was trying to make feel more like home. Each one listening. Frank made his first pass at 9:45 that evening. Parked half a block south for 14 minutes, then moved to an alternate position 3 streets over. He would rotate locations on a schedule that varied in timing and route. Because a man who has spent 22 years in police work understands that the thing that gets you noticed is never the single instance. It is the repetition. I continued the performance. At dinner that Tuesday, I paused a beat too long before answering a question about the weekend. A small hesitation, the kind that belongs to a man whose attention keeps slipping toward a place it cannot quite hold. Craig's eyes moved to me and then away. The brief, practiced assessment he had been running since October. I gave him exactly enough to sustain his narrative. Not enough by a considerable margin to be real. What the role cost me was something I had not anticipated and could not name precisely. Every morning I sat across the table from my son and allowed him to believe the confusion was genuine. I gave him what he was looking for, and each evening, after I locked the door, I sat on the bed and tried to locate the part of myself I had set aside that morning in order to be convincing. Some days I found it easily. Some days it took longer than I expected. The watches were listening. I told myself that each night. And what a man says when he believes he is the only clear mind in the room is almost always the most truthful thing you will ever hear from him. By the third week of February, Harriet had been working the financial trail for 16 days. When she called on a Monday evening, I locked the guest room door and sat on the floor with the tablet balanced on my knees. The same position I had used for every call since December. Back against the bed frame, voice low, one ear trained on the hallway for the sound of footsteps that should not be there. Harriet was not a woman who opened calls with preparation. 30 years of forensic work had cured her of any instinct toward preamble. She began by putting a document image on the screen, a screenshot of the first account she had found, the one that told her everything about the method before she understood the full scale. First National Platinum, she said. Opened August 14th, 2024. Account holder, Eugene R. Pratt. Authorized contact, Craig Pratt. Outstanding balance, $24,000. She gave me a moment to look at the date. August 14th. 6 weeks after I had moved into Craig's house. 4 weeks after I had signed the address form and provided the last 4 digits of my social security number at the kitchen table because my son had handed it to me and I had not read it closely enough. You have no memory of opening this account, she said. It was not a question. I confirmed it anyway. The social security number used to open it matches the one you provided on that form. He used the partial pre-fill you completed to establish a credit identity in your name. Once the first account was open and aging in good standing, the remaining accounts were straightforward to build. She stopped. Then she told me the rest. 12 credit cards, 3 personal loans. Combined outstanding balance, $167,000. Every account opened under my name. Craig listed as the authorized contact on each one. Harriet had located 19 documents bearing what appeared to be my signature. Account applications, authorization letters, consent forms for credit limit increases. She had sent 3 of the signatures to a forensic examiner she had used in federal cases, a woman now in private practice whose assessments had held up in court more times than Harriet could count. The examiner's response was precise. The signatures were skilled work, consistent in pen pressure and baseline angle, made by someone who had studied the original carefully and over time, but not sufficient for a federal proceeding. There were inconsistencies in the terminal strokes, the exact pressure pattern at the end of each letter that would not survive a qualified examiner's testimony under oath. Like a counterfeit watch, Harriet said. And I understood she had chosen the analogy deliberately. Good enough for a casual glance. Falls apart under a trained eye at the 47th second. I sat with the total for a moment. $167,000 accumulated under my name. Using 4 digits I had written on a form at a kitchen table because my son had handed it to me with a sentence about mail routing. I am 68 years old. I understood what that number represented when I converted it into years. It was a particular kind of arithmetic that does not require being spoken aloud to be fully felt. Where did the money go? I asked. Harriet had run the outflow analysis across 5 months. The majority of funds transferred from the credit accounts had moved into a private investment vehicle, a closed fund that had ceased operating 3 years earlier. She had confirmed Craig's name in the investor registry from the fund's final reporting period. He had placed capital into it. The fund had failed. He had lost what he put in. The transfers from the fraudulent accounts were not enrichment. They were reconstruction. Money moved to fill a hole that had already opened, because allowing the loss to surface meant answering questions Craig could not afford to answer. The remainder, a recurring pattern across the same 5-month window, were payments to what Harriet described as a private creditor outside the formal banking system, not an institution. The kind of arrangement that accepts money without generating documentation that travels through standard channels. Someone was being paid to stay quiet about something they knew. He is not spending this on himself, Harriet said. He is trying to prevent a specific outcome from becoming visible. The pattern is a man filling holes faster than they open, and he is running out of material to fill them with. She paused. The money is not going somewhere comfortable, Eugene. Someone knows something about your son's financial history, and they have been accepting monthly payments in exchange for not making that knowledge formal. Whatever Craig is building with the conservatorship and the Heartland deal, it is not greed. It is containment. I closed the tablet after the call and sat in the dark for several minutes. Then I went down for dinner. If you are still with me at this point, drop the number 6 in the comments. Just the number. That is all I need to know. You are here. A quick note. This story contains some fictionalized details shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. If that is not what you came for, this is a perfectly good moment to step away. No hard feelings. Craig was already at the table. He waited until the meal had settled, until the quiet rhythms of the evening had established themselves. Then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had spoken informally with a medical colleague about memory. A few observations he had been keeping to himself, things he had not wanted to raise until he had something more concrete. He thought a formal cognitive evaluation might be worth considering, just to have a baseline on record, for everyone's peace of mind. I feel fine, Craig, I said. Of course you do, he said. He said it with genuine warmth. A son's patience. Nothing in his voice that could be called unkind. But that is often how it presents in the early stages. He picked up his fork and continued eating. The subject moved on in the natural way, of a subject that had already made its point, without needing to be pressed. Patricia had looked down at her plate the moment Craig began speaking. She moved a piece of food from one side to the other, carefully, and did not lift her eyes during the exchange. Back in the guest room, door locked, notebook open, I wrote 2 things. The first was the structure. 2 tracks operating simultaneously, converging toward the same legal outcome. The debt accumulated under my name established a record of financial incompetence, the argument that I could not manage my own affairs. The medical evaluation Craig had just introduced would establish a record of cognitive decline, the argument that my own testimony was not reliable. Neither track alone was decisive in a probate court. Combined and filed together as supporting evidence, they produced a conservatorship ruling, a judicial determination that my ability to contest any document, any transaction, any transfer bearing my name, was no longer a legal requirement Craig needed to satisfy. He needed both tracks complete. He was very nearly there. The second thing I wrote was one line at the bottom of the page. He is very close. It was a Wednesday morning in early March. Gray light through the kitchen window. The smell of coffee already made by someone who had been up before me. When I came downstairs, I found a manila folder sitting at my place at the table. Not on the counter, not beside the fruit bowl. At my chair, oriented toward my seat, with the same deliberate positioning Craig had used for the power of attorney in December and the address form in October. Someone wanted me to find this. The moment I sat down. I opened it. The header read Cognitive Assessment. Eugene R. Pratt. Evaluating Physician. Dr. Alan Whitmore. MD. Neurology. Cedarville Valley Medical Center. 11 pages including cover sheet. Assessment narrative. Standardized test results. And a single-page recommendation. I read it the way I have read unfamiliar documents for 40 years. Starting with the header information and working systematically through the body before allowing any response to form. My face, I made certain, was the face of a man reading something that was only mildly interesting. The face of a man who did not understand precisely what he was holding. I had been wearing that face for 5 months. It fit well by now. The clinical language was fluent and technically appropriate, which told me it had been prepared by someone who either had medical training or had spent considerable time reading similar documents. The core finding appeared on page 4. Early indicators consistent with vascular cognitive impairment, most notably in domains of sequential financial reasoning and short-term working memory retention. The recommendation followed on page 9. Supervised decision-making protocol for major asset transactions, pending follow-up evaluation at 6-month interval. The date of the assessment was listed as February 26, 2025. I knew that date. On February 26th, I had been in Craig's house from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, at which point Craig had driven me to the pharmacy on Clement Street for a prescription pickup. The pharmacy printed a time-stamped receipt. I had kept it, as I kept all paper receipts from permitted errands, inside the notebook's back cover. A neurological evaluation at Cedarville Valley Medical Center, a facility located across town, does not happen as an incidental stop between a pharmacy run and dinner. It does not happen in under an hour. It does not happen without the patient sitting in the room. February 26th was a day I could account for in complete detail with documentation. Whatever this assessment described, it had not been performed on me on that date or any other. I turned back to the first page and examined the hospital letterhead. The font weight of the institution's name was slightly inconsistent, heavier in some characters than in others, in a way that suggested a digital reconstruction rather than an original printed template. I noted this without changing my expression or the pace at which I was turning pages. 40 years of distinguishing genuine from counterfeit had made the observation automatic. The eye finds the flaw. The hands keep moving. The face shows nothing. Craig came in from the hallway and refilled his coffee. He sat across from me. "What do you think?" he asked, after I had reached the final page. "I would want my own physician to review it first," I said. Measured. Cooperative in register. Nothing definitive. In content. Something shifted at the corner of Craig's mouth. Not a flinch. The micro-movement of a man who has recalculated something and is adjusting his next position before it shows. He reached across the table and picked up the folder. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." He left the kitchen with the folder under his arm. I remained at the table until I heard the hallway bathroom door close. Then I stood. The folder sat on the kitchen counter, where Craig had set it before going in. I walked past it to the far cabinet, and as I turned back with a glass in my hand, I caught the corner of the cover sheet, face up on the counter. In the lower right, a line I had not seen at the table. Patient observation record. Clinical witness. P. Pratt. LCSW. Patricia had signed it. I took my glass of water back to my chair and processed what that line meant. A licensed clinical social worker does not evaluate neurological function. That requires a physician or clinical neuropsychologist with specific credentialing. What Patricia had done, according to the document's own language, was serve as a clinical witness to a patient observation record. She had signed a statement attesting to behavioral incidents that had been presented to the evaluating physician as evidence of cognitive decline. Her role was to corroborate, through her professional signature and license number, a set of observations described to her. The question was whether she had generated those observations herself from what she had actually witnessed in this house, or whether Craig had described them to her, and she had signed because she trusted her husband's account of what was happening to his father. Those were two entirely different women. I did not yet know which one lived in this house. I went directly to the study while Craig was still in the bathroom. I photographed every page of the folder with the tablet. 11 images. I sent them to Harriet and Frank through the channel Frank had established in January. Then I returned the folder to the exact position and angle I had found it in and went back to my chair. Harriet called that evening. She had started with the State Medical Board's licensing registry. No Alan Whitmore. Not on the neurology service at Cedarville Valley Medical Center. Not on the consulting staff. Not in any listed credential category. She had accessed 4 years of historical personnel registries. Still no Whitmore. She had searched the state medical licensing database 4 different ways. No active license. No expired license. No disciplinary removal. No name close enough to suggest a transcription error. He does not appear to exist as a licensed physician in this state, Harriet said. Based on what I have checked, He may not exist as a licensed physician anywhere. The hospital letterhead, she continued, bore the institutional identity Cedarville Valley Medical Center had used prior to its merger with a regional health network in 2021. After the merger, the hospital had rebranded entirely. The pre-merger letterhead existed only on archive stationery or in digital reconstructions made from scanned copies of earlier documents. The document was not produced by that hospital, Harriet said. It was constructed to resemble one. Someone spent time on it, but not enough time on the details that a person who knew where to look would check first. Then she told me the part I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting for it. Craig filed a petition for conservatorship of your person and estate 3 weeks ago. You are the named subject. This fabricated assessment is listed as Exhibit A in the supporting documentation. There is a preliminary hearing on the court calendar 8 weeks from now. I sat on the floor of the guest room and looked at the opposite wall. This was not a plan in progress. It was a completed legal filing, processed through an official channel, assigned a case number, placed on a judge's calendar. If I failed to appear at that hearing with legitimate representation and competent documentation, the petition would move forward without meaningful opposition. Craig needed both tracks complete. The financial track to demonstrate my incompetence. The medical track to demonstrate my cognitive decline. Neither alone was sufficient. Together, they produced the ruling he needed to make my signature legally irrelevant. He was not very close anymore. He was there. I had not sent anything through the United States Postal Service in 3 years. The last package I mailed was a birthday gift to Liam in Montana, a restored mantel clock wrapped in the brown paper Dottie always kept in the hall closet, because she said proper wrapping was the difference between a package and a gesture. This time, the gesture contained something considerably more important than a birthday present. The cuckoo clock had been in the guest room closet since October, retrieved from the house after the gas company cleared the structure for limited entry. A Black Forest piece from the 1960s. Not valuable, not rare, but Dottie had loved the mechanism. She said there was something honest about a clock that announced itself. No subtlety. Just a small wooden bird that came out and told you what time it was, whether you wanted to know or not. It needed repair. The bellows had stiffened, and the chain drive required adjustment. I waited for a morning when Craig left early and Patricia was on overnight shift. Then sat at the guest room desk with a cloth laid flat and the clock open in front of me. I worked the bellows first, conditioning the leather. Then the chain drive, which required a tension adjustment I performed with needle nose pliers and a steadiness that came not from calm but from 40 years of practice that had made steadiness indistinguishable from it. Then I wrote the letter. 3 pages. Small handwriting. Everything Liam needed to know, in the order he needed to know it. The gas leak. The medication. The address form. The isolation. The hallway at 1147. The fabricated assessment. The conservatorship petition with a hearing 8 weeks away. Harriet's name. Her shop address on Belworth Street. And the instruction to contact her directly through no channel Craig could monitor. I folded the pages tight and placed them inside the pendulum housing, behind the counterweight, in a space invisible, unless someone removed the assembly entirely. A person opening the clock casually would see a mechanism. A person who knew to look behind the counterweight would find a letter from his father. I wrapped the clock in brown paper, addressed it to Liam, and carried it to the post office on Thursday during a pharmacy walk Craig had approved without suspicion. Roy Pemberton was behind the counter, 72 years old, 31 years carrying mail on the Cedarville route, retired to part-time window duty, because he said the counter was easier on his knees, but the work was the same. He had known Dottie since 1989. He had carried our mail for 2 decades without a single misdelivery, which across 31 years amounts to a record of precision that I, as a man who has spent his life among mechanisms that depend on precision, noticed and respected. Roy took the package. He weighed it. He looked at the Montana address. And then at me, with the expression of a man who has been watching something develop at a distance and has been waiting for a reason to pay closer attention. "How are things at Craig's place, Eugene?" "Quiet," I said. He held my gaze a moment longer than the transaction required. "Liam will be glad to hear from you," he said. He said it the way people in small towns say things that carry more weight than their surface. An acknowledgement that he had noticed something, and that the noticing was available to me if I needed it. Roy began watching Craig's house that week. Not formally. Simply with the attention of a man who has walked past every house on his route for 3 decades and knows when the rhythm of a household has changed. Liam called Harriet 4 days after the package arrived. She told me that evening in a brief call. He had opened the clock, found the letter behind the counterweight, read it twice. He had not called Craig. He had not called the house. He had called the number written at the bottom of the 3rd page and told Harriet he had a bag packed and could be on a plane within 4 hours. Harriet said his voice was steady. She said he asked precise questions in the correct order. She said he sounded like his mother. On April 14th, I walked into the offices of Margaret Chen, Elder Law, on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on Elm Street. The waiting room held 2 chairs, a low table, and a single potted fern someone had been tending with genuine intention. Margaret Chen came to the door herself. A woman of measured vocabulary and efficient movement, who indicated the chair across from her desk without unnecessary opening. I gave her the complete file. The address form, Harriet's credit findings, the 19 forged signatures, and the forensic examiner's terminal stroke analysis, the fabricated cognitive assessment with the pre-merger letterhead, the probate court filing. She read the core materials in 12 minutes, making margin notes in handwriting too small to read from across the desk. She drafted a motion to continue, a formal petition requesting postponement on 2 grounds: that the named subject required adequate time to prepare a documented legal response, and that the primary evidentiary exhibit was under active investigation for authenticity. She cited 3 procedural irregularities in the original filing and submitted the motion electronically before I left the building. The court granted it the following morning. The preliminary hearing was rescheduled to August 15th, 2025. I had time. Not enough of everything I needed, but time. That evening I called Harriet. "When the insurance report comes through on the gas investigation at my house, I want you to look at it immediately, before you set it aside for anything else. What are you expecting?" "I am not expecting anything specific. I am saying do not treat it as routine. There are questions about that gas leak that have not been asked in the right places yet." I said nothing further because I had nothing more specific to offer. What I had was the knowledge of a man who has spent 40 years examining mechanisms and knows that a gas leak at midnight in a wood frame house has an origin point, and that insurance investigations ask the same questions other investigators ask, working from a different direction, and with authority I did not possess. The questions would come. I needed to be ready when they did. And somewhere in a drawer 12 feet from where I slept every night, in a desk my son had stopped locking because he believed the man in his guest room no longer posed any threat worth guarding against, I suspected the answers were already waiting. There is a particular silence that fills a house at 3 in the morning when everyone inside it believes they are the only one awake. I had learned to recognize that silence the way I once recognized the sound of a faulty balance wheel, by what was missing, rather than by what was present. On the night of April 21st, a Monday, I lay in the guest room with my eyes open and listened for the absence of Craig's breathing rhythm through the wall. When it steadied into the long, even pattern I had memorized over 5 months, I placed my feet on the cold hardwood floor and stood without making a sound. The hallway between the guest room and Craig's study measured 14 feet. I had walked it 63 times since October. I knew which boards creaked. The 3rd plank from the bathroom threshold produced a faint groan under anything heavier than 140 pounds. I weighed 162. I stepped over it the way I had stepped over it every time before, placing my left foot against the baseboard where the joist met the wall and the wood held firm. Craig's study door was unlocked. It had been unlocked for 9 consecutive nights. I had checked each one. Before that, it had been locked every night for 4 months, ever since the evening I had stood outside it at 11:47 and heard the sound of a desk drawer sliding shut. Something had changed in Craig's routine. After Margaret Chen filed the motion to continue, he stopped locking the door. He stopped carrying the small brass key on his ring. I believed he had moved whatever he was protecting to a different location, and that belief kept me away for the first 3 nights. On the 4th night, I reconsidered. A man who moves something valuable does not stop locking the door. He stops believing the door matters. That is a different calculation entirely. And it told me the contents were still inside. The study smelled of Craig's aftershave and old paper. I did not turn on the overhead light. I used the flashlight application on the prepaid tablet Harriet had insisted I keep charged at all times, holding it low against my hip so the beam traveled along the carpet rather than across the window. The desk had 2 drawers on the right side and 1 wide drawer across the center. I had opened the center drawer once before, in January, and found nothing except a stapler, a roll of stamps, and a Cedarville High School yearbook from 2003. The top right drawer held Craig's personal checkbook, a calculator, and a stack of business cards from Heartland Prairie Development Group. I had photographed those cards in February. The second drawer was the one I had never opened. It sat lower, deeper, and heavier than the others. The wood around its brass handle showed faint scratches, the kind produced by a key inserted at an angle repeatedly over many months. I pulled it toward me. It resisted for a half-second, then released with a soft click that sounded, to my trained ear, like a latch mechanism rather than simple friction. Inside was a single manila folder, a white legal envelope, and a spiral notebook with a green cover. I opened the manila folder first. It contained 6 pages. The header on the first page read, Cedarville Fire District, Incident Report, Case Number CFD 2024-0471. The address listed was my address. The date was October 11th, 2024, the night of the gas leak. I had requested a copy of this report from the fire district in November and been told it was still under review. Craig had a copy in his desk. The investigator's summary on page 4 stated that the gas line to the basement furnace had been manually disconnected at the coupling joint, not fractured, not corroded, disconnected. The word was underlined in blue ink that was not part of the original print. Someone had read this report carefully and marked the passage that mattered most. I set the report on the carpet and opened the white envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A letter from a company called Prairie Meridian Holdings, addressed to Craig Pratt, dated September 14th, 2024. The letter confirmed receipt of a $48.72 deposit toward the acquisition of a 15-acre agricultural parcel on County Road 7, Cedarville, Ohio, contingent upon full title clearance by December 31st, 2024. The deposit had been made 27 days before the gas leak. I read the sentence again. 27 days. Craig had put money down on my land, on Dottie's land, nearly a month before someone disconnected the gas line in my basement while I slept. I did not open the green notebook. My hands were steady, but my mind was not. I photographed every page of the fire report and the Prairie Meridian letter, front and back, using the tablet camera with the flash disabled. I replaced the documents in the exact order I had found them, folder on the left, envelope on the right, notebook beneath both. I closed the drawer until the latch clicked. I walked back down the hallway, stepped over the 3rd plank, and returned to the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed for 11 minutes. I know because the Hamilton on the mantel downstairs chimed the quarter hour at 3:15, and I had entered the room at 3:04. In those 11 minutes, I did not think about Craig. I thought about Dottie. I thought about the afternoon she planted the first row of mammoth gray striped sunflowers along the eastern fence and told me that the roots of a sunflower can reach 6 feet into the earth, deeper than most people ever bother to look. She said that was why they stood so tall. Not because of the sun, because of what held them in place underneath. At 3:17, I sent 2 photographs to Harriet and 1 to Frank. I typed no message. The images were enough. By 3:20, Harriet replied with a single word. Tomorrow. Frank replied at 3:29 with 2 words. Do not leave. I did not leave. I lay down, placed the tablet under my pillow, and listened to Craig's breathing through the wall. It had not changed. He slept the way a man sleeps when he believes every door in his house is still doing what he built it to do. I did not return to the second drawer the following night. Harriet had told me to wait, and when Harriet told a person to wait, the instruction carried the same weight as a judge's order. She called the prepaid tablet at 6:14 in the morning, before Craig's alarm, and spoke for less than 2 minutes. She said the fire report photographs were clear enough for forensic comparison. She said the Prairie Meridian letter matched a shell company she had flagged 3 weeks earlier during the Credit Bureau trace. She said Frank would be parked on Wexford Lane by 9 and would remain there until noon. Then she said one more thing. She said, Eugene, the notebook is the last piece. Do not rush it. A clock that is wound too tight breaks the mainspring. I understood her. I had broken 2 mainsprings in 40 years, both times because I applied pressure faster than the metal could absorb it. The first was a 17-joule Elgin from 1908. The second was a railroad-grade Hamilton that had survived 2 world wars and could not survive my impatience on a Tuesday afternoon in 1991. I never broke a third. I waited 4 days. During those 4 days, I performed the routine Craig expected. I took my medication at 7 each morning. The real pill from my travel bag, swapped in place of the lighter counterfeit he continued to supply without variation. I ate breakfast at the kitchen table. I read the Cedarville Gazette on the front porch. I spoke to Craig about the weather, about the price of diesel, about the gutters that needed cleaning before summer. On Wednesday evening, Patricia set a plate of roasted chicken in front of me, and her hand paused above the table for a full second before she pulled it back. She looked at me the way a person looks at a locked door when they suspect what is behind it, but are not yet ready to turn the handle. I noted the pause. I did not respond to it. On Friday, April 25th, Craig left the house at 8:45 for a meeting in Columbus. He told Patricia he would return by 6. Patricia left at 9:30 for a shift at the county social services office. The house emptied the way a watch case empties when you remove the movement, suddenly and completely, leaving nothing but the shell. I entered the study at 9:41. The second drawer opened with the same soft click. The manila folder and the white envelope were exactly as I had left them. The green notebook sat beneath both. I lifted it out and carried it to the guest room, where the morning light came through the east window at an angle that made reading comfortable without a lamp. The notebook contained 41 handwritten pages. The handwriting was Craig's. I had studied his handwriting for 5 months, comparing it against the forged signatures Harriet had catalogued, and I could distinguish his natural script from his imitation of mine, the way a jeweler distinguishes 14-karat gold from 18. His natural hand leaned slightly to the right, pressed harder on downstrokes, and left a small gap between the letters O and N that disappeared when he was copying someone else's rhythm. The first entry was dated August 2nd, 2024. It read, Spoke with Kessel. 15 acres appraised at $420,000. Development potential with rezoning pushes to $650. Timeline. Title clear by December, close by March. Dad signs or dad is removed from the equation. L will follow once the conservatorship holds. I read the sentence 3 times. Dad signs or dad is removed from the equation. I had spent 6 months collecting evidence of what Craig had done. I had never before seen, in his own handwriting, what Craig had intended. The entries continued in irregular intervals, sometimes 3 days apart, sometimes 2 weeks. September 9th. Prairie Meridian deposit confirmed. $47,000 wired from account ending 4172. Kessel says rezoning hearing is November. September 28th. Gas company contract expires October 15th. Window is 2 weeks. I stopped reading. I placed my index finger on the page and held it there for 6 seconds. Window is 2 weeks. The gas leak occurred on October 11th. 13 days after this entry. I resumed. October 14th. 3 days after the leak. House ventilated. No structural damage. Dad moved in. Phase 2 begins. The clinical tone did not surprise me. What surprised me was the word phase. It implied a structure, a sequence, a design. My son had not acted out of desperation. He had acted out of architecture. November through January documented the mail interception, the phone redirection, the forged messages to Liam, the medication substitution, and the Heartland Prairie correspondence, all written in the same steady hand, all organized by date and outcome. February's entries detailed the cognitive assessment, naming Patricia as the person who provided the letterhead template from her workplace database, and identifying the fictional Dr. Alan Whitmore as a name Craig selected from a 1997 obituary in the Canton Repository. The final entry was dated March 18, 2025. It read, Chen filed a motion. Hearing postponed. Need to accelerate. If conservatorship fails, there is no second path. I photographed all 41 pages. It took 14 minutes. I replaced the notebook beneath the folder and the envelope, closed the drawer, and left the study. I walked out the back door, crossed the yard to the fence line, where Dottie's first row of mammoth gray-striped sunflowers had once grown, and stood there for a long time. At 10:22, I called Harriet from the prepaid tablet. I said 4 words. I have the notebook. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, she said, call Margaret Chen. Today. Do not wait until Monday. I called Margaret Chen at 10:31. She answered on the second ring. I told her what the notebook contained. She asked me to read the entry from September 28th aloud. I read it. She was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said, Mr. Pratt, this is no longer a conservatorship defense. This is a criminal referral. I hung up and looked at the sunflower field across County Road 7. The stalks were still 3 months from full height. But the roots, I knew, were already deep enough to hold. Margaret Chen filed the living trust documents on a Monday, the 5th of May, 2025. The trust placed Dottie's 50% share of the sunflower farm into a protected instrument requiring the written consent of both Craig and Liam for any transfer, sale, or encumbrance. It named Eugene as trustee and Harriet Voss as successor trustee in the event of his incapacity. The conservatorship petition, even if granted, could no longer override the trust. Margaret explained it to me in her office using language I appreciated for its precision. She said, The trust is a finished clock, Mr. Pratt. The conservatorship is a hand trying to reach through the glass to move the hands. It cannot. I asked her about the criminal referral. She said she had forwarded the 41 photographs of Craig's notebook, the Fiery District report, the Prairie Meridian deposit letter, Harriet's forensic signature analysis, and the fabricated cognitive assessment to the county prosecutor's office on April 28th. The prosecutor reviewed the file for 6 days and then contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Cincinnati. Margaret told me the FBI took jurisdiction because the credit fraud crossed state lines. The wire transfer to Prairie Meridian originated from an out-WUV state institution, and the forged documents involved a federally insured bank. She said an agent named Delacroix had been assigned. She said the agent asked for one thing: a controlled environment in which Craig's behavior could be observed and recorded by neutral witnesses with no prior law enforcement obligation. I suggested the bank. Margaret paused. Then she understood. She had read the trust documents. She knew the final step required Eugene Pratt to appear in person at Cedarville Savings and Trust to execute the trust acknowledgement before a notary and 2 witnesses. She also knew that Craig monitored my calendar through Patricia and would learn of the appointment within hours of its scheduling. I told Margaret I wanted Craig to know. I wanted him to walk through those glass doors believing he still had time to stop me. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "I will schedule it for Wednesday, May 14th, 9 o'clock. I spent the next 9 days preparing. Frank Olsted confirmed he would be inside the bank in his capacity as a part-time security consultant, which gave him a legitimate reason to be present and access to the 6 ceiling-mounted cameras that recorded every angle of the lobby. Roy Pemberton agreed to position himself near the front entrance at 8:45, carrying a newspaper and wearing the same tan jacket he had worn every Wednesday morning for 11 years. Harriet prepared a sealed evidence envelope containing certified copies of all forensic findings to be handed to Agent Delacroix immediately upon signal. Liam flew into Columbus on Tuesday evening and checked into a motel on Route 42 under his mother's maiden name. He did not call Craig. He did not call me. Harriet had told him that the fewer voices in the air, the cleaner the recording. On Wednesday morning, I woke at 5:12. I showered, dressed in the gray suit I had worn to Dottie's funeral, and placed 6 pocket watches in the breast pocket of my jacket. 5 of them contained micro ESD recording units with full batteries, verified by Dennis the previous afternoon. The 6th, the Waltham 1892, held no device. It was simply Dottie's favorite, and I carried it because she would have wanted to be present for what came next. I arrived at Cedarville Savings and Trust at 8:51. The lobby smelled of limestone and floor polish. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency I could feel in my molars. I sat in the 3rd chair from the left in the front row, placed the manila folder containing the trust acknowledgement on my lap, and waited. Frank stood behind the teller counter, adjusting a monitor cable. Roy settled near the glass doors with his newspaper open to the crossword page. A woman I had not seen before sat at a desk in the far corner, typing slowly. I learned later that her name was Agent Delacroix, and she had been inside the bank since 7:30. At 9:14, Craig's silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. He sat in the car for 4 minutes. I watched him through the window. He was looking at his phone. At 9:18, he stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the entrance. Roy turned a page of his newspaper without looking up. Craig pushed through the glass doors at 9:19. He scanned the lobby, saw me, and stopped. His jaw tightened the way. It always tightened when a situation deviated from his expectation. He had expected to find me alone. He crossed the lobby in 7 steps. He did not sit. He stood over me and said, "What are you doing here, Dad?" I held up the manila folder. He read the header through the clear plastic window. His face changed. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. The recognition of a man who realizes the mechanism he thought he controlled has been running on a different spring entirely. He reached down and closed his hand around my left wrist. His grip was harder than it needed to be. He leaned forward and said, "Sign it over, or I will have you declared unfit." His voice was low, but the marble carried it. Every camera in the ceiling recorded the angle of his arm. Every watch in my pocket captured the frequency of his words. Agent Delacroix stopped typing. Frank stepped out from behind the counter. Roy folded his newspaper. I looked at my son. I looked at the hand wrapped around my wrist, the same hand I had held when he was 4 years old, and afraid of the dark, the same hand I had guided along the edge of a watch case when he was 12, and curious about how things worked. I felt the 6 watches ticking against my chest, each one a heartbeat that Dottie had collected across 50 years of loving a life that was slower and more careful than the world demanded. Craig pulled. My chair shifted. I did not resist. I let the momentum carry me forward and down, onto the cold limestone floor, where I lay for exactly 7 seconds. I counted them the way I had always counted them, by the rhythm of the Waltham against my ribs. Then I smiled. Frank's badge was visible before the 8th second began. Roy was at the door. Agent Delacroix was standing. And somewhere behind me, I heard the sound I had been waiting 11 months to hear. It was not a voice. It was not a siren. It was the soft, mechanical click of a lock engaging. The glass doors of Cedarville Savings and Trust ceiling shut, with Craig Pratt still inside. Frank Olsted reached Craig before Craig could release my wrist. Frank did not raise his voice. He placed one hand on Craig's shoulder and said, "Step back, sir," in the same tone he might have used to direct traffic on a quiet road. Craig released me. His fingers opened slowly, one at a time, as though each one required a separate decision. I remained on the limestone floor for 2 more seconds, not because I could not stand, but because I wanted the cameras to record the full image. A 68-year-old man lying on cold stone in a gray funeral suit with 6 pocket watches ticking against his ribs. I wanted that image to exist in a format no one could argue with. Frank helped me to my feet at 9:21. My left wrist carried 4 red impressions where Craig's fingers had pressed into the skin. I noted them the way I would note pressure marks on a watch case that had been gripped too hard during repair. They would fade within an hour. The recordings would not. Agent Delacroix crossed the lobby in 9 steps. She was shorter than I had expected, 5 feet 4 at most, with dark hair pulled back and a navy blazer that did not quite conceal the badge clipped to her belt. She stopped 3 feet from Craig and said his full name, Craig Robert Pratt. She said it clearly, without hurry, the way a person reads an inscription on a watch. Then she informed him that he was under arrest on federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial exploitation. She listed the charges the way Margaret Chen had listed the trust provisions, with the precision of someone who understood that words, once spoken in a federal context, could not be taken back. Craig did not speak. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the expression of a man who has opened a watch he believed was broken and discovered that every gear inside was turning exactly as designed. He understood in that moment that the mechanism had never malfunctioned. He had simply never known what it was built to do. A second agent entered through the rear service door. He placed Craig in handcuffs while Delacroix read the remainder of the Miranda statement. Roy Pemberton held the front door open as they escorted Craig across the parking lot. Roy did not look away. He watched the way a man watches who has delivered mail to a family for 30 years and understands that some packages arrive too late to prevent what they contain. The bank manager, a woman named Sandra Gill, whom I had known for 19 years, approached me with a glass of water and a trembling hand. She said, "Mr. Pratt, do you need medical attention?" I told her I did not. I told her I needed a notary. She blinked twice, then walked to the back office and returned with a notary stamp, 2 witness forms, and a pen. At 9:37, I signed the trust acknowledgement. Sandra notarized it. Frank and Roy signed as witnesses. The document that would protect Dottie's sunflower farm from any future attempt to sell, transfer, or encumber it without the mutual written consent of both sons was complete. It had taken 11 months to reach this table. The signing itself took 40 seconds. At 10:15, Liam walked through the front doors. He had driven from the Route 42 motel without stopping. He wore a flannel shirt and work boots, and he looked so much like Dottie that I had to place my hand on the counter to steady myself. He crossed the lobby and put his arms around me without saying a word. He held on for 12 seconds. I counted them because counting was the only thing that kept me standing. When he let go, he looked at the manila folder on the counter and said, "Is it done?" I said it was. He nodded. Then he said, "Mom would have made you eat something by now." I laughed for the first time in 11 months. It was a small laugh, barely a sound. But it moved through my chest, the way the Waltham's ticking moved through my chest. Steady and involuntary, and proof that something inside was still functioning. Margaret Chen arrived at 10:42 with a second sealed envelope for the county recorder's office. She reviewed the notarized trust, confirmed the witness signatures, and placed the original in her briefcase. She told me the FBI would execute a search warrant on Craig's home by noon. She said Patricia Pratt had been contacted separately that morning and had agreed to cooperate. Patricia's statement, Margaret explained, confirmed that Craig had pressured her into providing the hospital letterhead template and signing the fabricated cognitive assessment as a clinical witness. Patricia told investigators she had objected twice and that Craig had responded by threatening to disclose a disciplinary notation on her social work license that he had obtained through a records request 18 months earlier. Margaret said the prosecutor would take Patricia's cooperation into account. She did not say what that meant. She did not need to. I asked Margaret one question. I asked whether the evidence from the pocket watches would be admissible. She said the recordings fell within Ohio's one-party consent statute because I was present during every captured conversation. She said the micro SD cards from 5 watches contained a combined 11 hours and 47 minutes of audio. She said the February 14th recording, in which Craig discussed the conservatorship timeline with an unidentified male voice on speakerphone, was 47 seconds long and contained the phrase, "Once the old man is off the deed, we close in March." She said that phrase, combined with the notebook and the fire report, constituted what the federal prosecutor described as a clean case. I thanked her. She shook my hand and paused at the door. She said, "Your wife chose her attorney well, Mr. Pratt." I did not understand. Margaret smiled for the first and only time in our professional relationship and said, "Dottie came to me in 2019. She is the one who drafted the tenancy in common clause. She asked me to make it unbreakable. She left. I stood in the lobby of Cedarville Savings and Trust for a long time after that." Frank had returned to his desk. Roy had gone home. Liam sat in the third chair from the left, the same chair I had occupied an hour earlier, reading the trust document line by line. The 6 pocket watches ticked inside my jacket. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The limestone floor held every sound the morning had made and gave none of it back. Dottie had known. She had known before I did. Before Craig did. Before any of us understood what was coming. She had sat in Margaret Chen's office 6 years before she died and built a lock around 15 acres of sunflowers that no one in her family, not even the son she loved and could not save, would ever be able to pick. I did not open the envelope that day. I did not open it the following week. I carried it with me when Liam drove me back to the farmhouse on County Road 7, and I set it on the kitchen table beside the walnut display case that held the 6 pocket watches, and I let it sit there while the house remembered how to breathe with someone living in it again. The farmhouse had been empty for 7 months. Liam had arranged for a local crew to inspect the gas lines, replace the basement coupling joint, and certify the furnace before my return. The report came back clean. Every connection was secure. Every valve turned the way it was supposed to turn. I read the report at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening and thought about how a house can be repaired in a single afternoon, while the family that lives inside it may take years, or may never be repaired at all. Craig's federal trial was scheduled for October. Margaret Chen told me the prosecutor's office had compiled a case file exceeding 400 pages. The green notebook alone constituted 41 pages of self-documented intent. The Fire District report confirmed the gas line had been manually disconnected. The Prairie Meridian deposit letter established financial motive 27 days before the incident. The 19 forged signatures, the 12 credit accounts, the 3 personal loans totaling $167,000, the fabricated cognitive assessment attributed to a physician who had been dead since 1997. All of it formed a chain so complete that Margaret said the defense attorney had already begun discussing a plea arrangement. I told her I did not want to know the terms. She respected that. Patricia Pratt filed for divorce on June 2nd. She moved to her sister's house in Dayton and did not contact me. I did not contact her. Harriet told me that Patricia's cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor included a provision that no charges would be filed against her in exchange for full testimony regarding the letterhead fabrication, the cognitive assessment, and Craig's financial activities during the period she resided in the household. Harriet said Patricia cried during her deposition. I believed that. I had seen the pause at the kitchen table, the hand hovering above the surface, the look of a woman standing at a locked door. She had known. She had not known how to stop it. I could not forgive her entirely. But I could understand the shape of her silence, because I had lived inside a similar silence for 11 months, and I knew what it cost to maintain it. Liam stayed through the end of May. He helped me replant the eastern fence row with mammoth gray-striped sunflower seeds, the same variety Dottie had planted in 1991. We worked in the early morning when the soil was cool, and the light came across the field at the angle Dottie always said made the dirt look like it was thinking about something. Liam did not talk much while he worked. He knelt in the row beside me, pressed each seed into the earth with his thumb, and moved to the next hole without looking up. On the third morning, I told him he planted the way his mother planted. He stopped, sat back on his heels, and said, I know. Then he continued. On the first day of June, a Saturday, I sat alone at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee and the sealed envelope. The house was quiet. The display case stood on the counter to my left, all 6 watches visible through the glass, their second hands moving in 6 slightly different rhythms that together created a sound like a small, complicated heartbeat. The envelope was the same as it had been for 2 years. Manila. Sealed with clear tape. Dottie's handwriting across the front. For Eugene. When the time is right, you will know. I knew. I opened it with a butter knife, sliding the blade under the flap, the way I would slide a case knife under the back of a watch. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small object wrapped in a square of blue velvet. I unfolded the paper first. Dottie's handwriting filled one side of the page. She wrote the way she spoke, without hurry, without decoration, every word placed exactly where it needed to be. Eugene, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong with one of our boys, and you have done what needed to be done to protect what we built. I am sorry. I cannot be there. I am sorry I saw it coming and could not say it out loud while I was still able to sit beside you and hold your hand while you heard it. I went to Margaret in 2019 because I noticed things a mother notices and a wife does not say. I asked her to make the deed unbreakable. She did. I asked her to keep it between us. She did. I do not know which son it will be. I pray I am wrong about both. But if I am not wrong, then you will need what is in this envelope. Not the paper. The other thing. Open it. I set the letter down and picked up the velvet square. It was heavier than I expected. I unfolded the cloth, and a pocket watch fell into my palm. It was a Waltham Model 1883, open a face, coin silver case, with a hand-engraved sunflower on the dust cover that I had never seen before. I turned it over. On the back, in Dottie's engraving, were 2 lines. For the man who fixes what others cannot. 7 watches. 1 family. All the time in the world. I held the 7th watch in my hand for a long time. The second hand moved in a rhythm I did not recognize. Slightly slower than the 6 watches in the display case, as though it were counting a different kind of time. I placed it in the case beside the others. It fit exactly into a space I had never noticed was empty. I drank my coffee. I watched the morning light cross the kitchen floor the way it had crossed it every morning for 31 years. Outside, the sunflower field stretched east along County Road 7. 15 acres of dark soil, holding seeds that would not show above the surface for another 2 weeks, but were already, beneath the ground, reaching down with roots strong enough to hold the whole plant steady when the wind came. I washed my cup. I placed it on the drying rack. I walked outside, down the porch steps, across the gravel path, and into the first row of the eastern field. The air smelled like turned earth and the faintest trace of something sweet that I could never identify, but Dottie always called the smell of a day that is going to be good. I stood there with 7 watches ticking inside the house behind me and 15 acres of silence in front of me, and I understood finally what Dottie had always known. Some things do not need to be repaired. They only need to be protected. And the people who protect them do not need to be loud, or fast, or strong. They only need to be patient enough to let the roots go deep before the storm arrives.